When I was 8 years old, I moved in with my Aunt Laura and Uncle Richard. My mother had passed away in a car accident, and my father, grieving and overwhelmed, said he needed time to get his life together. Laura and Richard lived in a small town in Oregon, far from the bustling city life I had known in Seattle. Everything was quieter there. More still, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked and people waved as they drove by. Their house sat on the edge of a wide field bordered by pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. My first few days there were filled with a confusing mix of sadness and curiosity. Laura was warm and patient, with a soft voice that made even the toughest mornings feel manageable. Uncle Richard, on the other hand, was quiet. He wasn't cold or unkind, just watchful. I often caught him studying me when he thought I wasn't looking. As weeks passed, I started to settle into a routine. I went to the local elementary school, made a couple of friends, and began to explore the woods behind the house. One of my favorite places to go was a little creek about a mile into the trees. The water was icy cold, and the sound of it bubbling over rocks helped me clear my thoughts. I didn't know it then, but that creek would become a kind of sanctuary for me. Uncle Richard had a brother named Alan who lived about 20 minutes away. Alan came by often, usually on Sundays, bringing his booming laugh and stories about his time in the Navy. He was taller than Richard, with wide shoulders and a crooked nose that made him look like he'd seen his share of trouble. There was something in the way Alan looked at me, though something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't scary or bad, exactly, but it made me uncomfortable. It was like he expected something from me, some answer I didn't know I had. One Sunday afternoon, Alan arrived as usual. I was in the kitchen helping Laura prepare lunch. She was slicing vegetables when she asked me to run out to the porch and tell the men that food would be ready soon. I pushed open the screen door and found them sitting on the porch, beer bottles in hand, both of them quiet. It was strange. Alan was never quiet. But in that moment, he and Uncle Richard sat in complete silence, both looking out over the field. When I spoke, they both turned to look at me, and something about the way their eyes locked on mine made me freeze. Alan gave a nod and a small smile, but Richard said nothing. His eyes, though they seemed to flicker with something between warning and guilt. I didn't understand it then, but that moment would stay with me for years. As I got older, I began to notice more things that didn't make sense. There were conversations that stopped when I entered the room, lingering glances exchanged between Richard and Laura, and long stretches of silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. One evening when I was 13, I overheard them arguing in the living room after they thought I'd gone to bed. Their voices were hushed but intense. "You can't just ignore it," Laura said. "I'm not ignoring it," Richard replied. "But if he finds out, he deserves to know the truth." "What good will it do? It'll just break him." The next morning, they acted like nothing had happened. I wanted to ask what they were talking about, but I was too afraid of the answer. That summer, I started spending more time at the library. It was my escape, a quiet place where I could read and think. One afternoon, I found an old box of my mom's belongings in the attic. It was filled with letters, photographs, and a few keepsakes. As I flipped through the contents, I noticed something strange. A letter from my mother, too. Laura, dated just a few weeks before her death, mentioned someone named A. She wrote, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. It says it's for the best, but I'm not so sure anymore." I stared at that letter for what felt like hours. Could that have been Alan? And what secret was she talking about? I confronted Laura the next day. I didn't know what I expected her to say, but I needed answers. I showed her the letter, my hands trembling. She read it slowly, her face draining of color. "I think it's time you knew," she said finally. We sat down at the kitchen table and she took a deep breath. "Your mother, she wasn't just Your mother. She was also someone who carried the weight of protecting you from something you weren't ready to understand. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alan isn't just your uncle. He's your biological father. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling over. Laura went on to explain that years ago, my mother had a brief relationship with Alan before she met my dad. It had ended badly. When she discovered she was pregnant, Alan had insisted that she keep it quiet. Richard, who was already married to Laura at the time, knew about it, but agreed to keep the secret for the sake of peace in the family. But why wouldn't she tell me? I asked. She was scared, Laura said, and she wanted you to have a stable life with someone she trusted. Your adoptive father, loved you. We all did. But the truth was always there, just beneath the surface. I remembered all those looks Richard gave me, the silence on the porch, the tension whenever Alan was around. It all made sense now. Richard had known I was Alan's son, and every time he looked at me, he saw the weight of that truth. He saw the burden he'd been carrying for years. Later that night, I found Richard sitting on the back porch. The sky was full of stars, and the field was lit with moonlight. You knew? I said, not as a question, but a statement. He nodded slowly. I did. Why didn't you tell me? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. Because I didn't want you to think less of your mother or of yourself. She did what she thought was right. And I tried to protect that choice. From who? From Alan. From the world. Maybe even from myself. We sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, he reached over and rested a hand on my shoulder. You may not be my blood, he said, but you're my family. Always have been. Always will be in the years that followed. I kept a polite distance from Alan. I never confronted him about the truth, and he never offered an explanation. His eyes told me everything I needed to know. I saw it now how he looked at me that day on the porch, not with affection, but with regret, with guilt. When I turned 18, I moved back to Seattle for college. Richard and Laura drove me there and helped me settle in. As we stood outside the dorm, I hugged them both tightly. Thank you, I whispered. Richard just nodded. His eyes, once full of secrets, were finally at peace. Now, as an adult, I think back often to that time in Oregon, to the quiet house, the creek, the tension that lived in the silences between words. I understand now that love doesn't always come wrapped in clear, easy answers. Sometimes it's tangled in secrets, in sacrifices made in the name of protection. And sometimes the things people don't say tell you more than all the words in the world. They said nothing, but my uncle's eyes told me everything. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.